So here is my existing interface for this list of cards. The cards will display when I hover over the card name. The way that that works is that I put this A tag around the card's name, and then there's a JavaScript library that looks up the image from the gatherer data. So you can see how the text is kind of blurry in this card, and that is why it's one of the main reasons why I'm switching to the Scryfall data. I have another video where I show that I show the process for ingesting the data from MTG JSON to get all the cards and some of their type and color and casting cost info, and then run through that entire list, gathering images and multiverse IDs from Scryfall. So I think that in terms of an interface for including a card, what I'm going to do is add a link to this bank of editing tools that the list manager can see when they're hovering over a item. So eventually I think I'll replace these all with icons, but for now they're just text links. Those are in my helpers because they are methods that I use in the view layer, HTML generation. Listed item display, and then there's a method, listed item editing tools. So I have the move up and move down links for items that are in ordered lists. But most of my lists are randomized because I think that is a purer way to make a list in a lot of use cases. Now, obviously, the list manager can choose whichever they want, switch back and forth at any time, but I'm trying to explore the space that is possible with randomized lists. Include card. Okay, so now I have to say what this link is linked to. And this is the point where I'm going to start to write code that's not going to work. So if I reloaded the page, it would generate an error. The path that this link needs to link to is going to be one that displays the form for creating a new object. So it's called the new card inclusion path. And I guess I'll just show you that now I get an error. New card inclusion path is not defined. So the way that I define paths is in the roots file. And I guess I'll go ahead and put this down here. Resources, card, inclusions. So resources will give me 7 paths: new, create, edit, update, destroy, show, and index, which is a show all type of action. Now I quickly think if I want those. So new, yes, I want that. Create, yes, I want that. Edit and update, I don't think are actually relevant to this because I'm not really adding any metadata to the card inclusion. I guess potentially I would say like the ordering. Yeah, okay, that's an interesting point. If I include multiple cards in a single listed item, then I would want to allow the list manager to reorder them. But for now, I'm not doing that. We're just taking this one step at a time. So do I want to block out the edit path? I guess it, okay, I'm gonna leave the full 7 resource routes in here for now, and any ones that I do not want people to use will simply not be implemented in the controller. So now that I've done that, this error should go away. And if I click this, I will get to a new error. Uninitialized constant card inclusions controller. Okay, so what I'm going to do is create the controller, which will handle that request. Okay, and there is a Rails generator to help me create controllers. It would give me all 7 of those methods implemented, but I've gotten out of the habit of using that particular generator, and for the purposes of this, I think it's probably simpler for you to understand to just create the methods as we need them. Okay. We probably don't need actually any code yet. We could say card inclusion equals card inclusion.new. Yeah, I like that as a tactic. We can use that so that our code that we're about to write now is slightly more reusable. Card inclusion. Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, this line isn't really giving us any logic. So okay. So for this application, I'm using mostly JavaScript templates. And then for the actual form, rather than using an HTML template, I'm using a helper method, similar to what you see here. So the listed item form, it's not generated by a template. I'll give you a contrast. So the list form is a template. This is HTML with ERB tags, and this file here is an HTML template. So this is the form that people use to name their list, describe their list, and then set the options. In contrast, the listed item form, when you're adding an item to a list, this is a form that I use in a couple different places, not just one place. So I made it into a helper, and I use pretty much the same methods, but the formatting is a little different because this is pure Ruby instead of embedded Ruby. So I have to use plus signs, I have to use parentheses, and there's a couple other distinctions between the two syntaxes. Like I use this thing HTML safe when I'm trying to embed HTML. So going forward with this process, and this is the technique that I could use to avoid generating the blank object here. In this helper, I say you can either pass in an object that you're editing, or you can generate an object that you're creating. And this is kind of cool because it allows you to say which list you're adding it to. So I'm actually going to kind of emulate this for what I'm doing with this card inclusion helper. Although I'm not going to be making an edit form for these. If I were to do a reordering thing, it wouldn't use a form, it would just use a link. Okay, yeah, backtracking on that, I'm going to make this, it's still going to use a JS template, but it's also going to use an HTML template. Yeah, I think this is a little bit simpler for you guys to follow since it's the first time we're going through this process. So, form with card inclusion, do card inclusion form. Card inclusion form dot text field card name. Okay, so I've already kind of written another bug. So this, using this as the object to hang this off of means that it is going to ask this object for that attribute. That way it can preload the data into the field. So there's a couple options here. One is I can add a method so that this object knows how to respond to this method. The other is that I can take out this object so that I use a slightly different variant of the text field generation code. I'm going to do the first one, so I'm going to make a method called card name on card inclusion form. And since all it needs to do is store a value, I'm going to make it an attr accessor. Okay. That just seems like something that will be useful for this thing to have. Okay, so then this form also needs a submit button. And to put a little text on the button, I'll say include. Thinking about whether to use capitalization or punctuation. No, I'm going to go with no. Okay, so now in this JS template, so the basic technique that I usually put into these templates is I start with one thing, which I'm going to adjust, and then I have another thing which I'm going to put in there. And so this is JavaScript. What I usually put into the things, however, is text that's generated by Ruby methods. So I put the J there so that the Ruby code will escape the characters so that they're safe to put into JavaScript code. And then I'll say the thing on the page that I want to insert this into. So I think basically the upper right corner is a good spot for me to have a little text field. So looking at the markup in that area, so I have the designation, the editing tools, and then the expression. So if I go between the designation and the, I could just put it at the beginning of the editing tools, maybe? I mean, that, I could put it prior to this, inside this. It kind of makes sense to have it inside there. Okay, so see how this says ID, editing tools for listed item 80? That's the number of the listed item. And since it's an ID, we have to use the sharp sign in order to tell jQuery that that is where this thing is going to go. And I have to populate this variable. So I'll go back to my controller. Okay, and then I'll go back to where I created that link. Oops, down in the editing tools. And I'll update the path that this link is linked to with a parameter listed item ID is listed item.id. And this variable will be populated because we pass it in when we called this method. Okay, so at this point what pops into my head is that when I have a new action, I often want it to work whether or not some data is already specified. So I often want that. Right now, I don't care. It's something that I'm thinking about, and potentially how the code that I'm writing will generate bugs in the future, but I'm not worried about it now. For the record, I think this will not throw an error if this is blank. I should know that after using the system for 10 years. It has changed over the course of those 10 years, I'm pretty sure. So that's why I'm waffling, but it doesn't matter right now because we're always going to pass that parameter. Our system as it stands is complete. Now, somebody could visit this link without having clicked on a link that I generated. If that errors out, I don't think I care. Okay, so having provided this ID and so on, I think that this variable will be accessible to this JavaScript template. So, okay, we're getting the ID. We know where to put it. Now the question is, what are we putting there? So what we're gonna put there is our new form here. So we're gonna say render form. You have to escape that for JavaScript. And instead of append, I think I want to put that at the top of that editing bank. So I think jQuery will let me prepend. Insert content specified by parameter to the beginning of each element in the set of matched elements. Okay. So you see there's two versions of this. It depends on like if this is first and this is second, then I use prepend. If this is first and this is second, then I use prepend 2. Okay, and the syntax highlighting here is telling me that I ended the quoted group, and I'm now outside of my, so my group is actually right here. The syntax highlighting is telling me that the group ends here, but that's actually incorrect because I started another group which starts and ends here using these angle brackets and %equal tags. So the syntax highlighting is not fully accurate there. I could use double quotes for one of those rather than single quotes, but this is my preference. This is how I do it. I use single quotes. I use single quotes more than I use double quotes. Okay, so rendering the form. So will this form have access to this variable that we set? I think it will. And does this now have enough information to render? I think it does. So this form, okay, I have to, this form width is a new API for Rails 5. It used to be form 4. Form width is a slightly new version of that, so the API has changed a little bit, and I have to write this argument label before putting the object that I'm modifying. And in order for the controller to know which list item we are attaching this card to, I want to pass that data through this form back to the server. Okay, so it's not called listed item ID, it's called piece ID. And then there's a second field piece type. Okay, so this is fun. So remember that piece is not always going to be a listed item. Here I'm going to consider allowing myself to take a step ahead and build something that I'm not using yet. Thinking about the variable name that I use here, could just say piece. And then here, I can say DOM ID piece. It will still know to put this editing tools for listed item. It will put the word listed item in there because piece will be a listed item. See, the code doesn't actually see what I'm calling these variables, it just sees the objects that I'm putting in the variables. So changing the text that I'm writing here in the code doesn't actually influence the text that is coming out in that HTML. And then here I can just say piece. Oh, except I don't want to say type. Say class.name. Okay. So now let's give this a try and see what happens. Okay, so depending on what type of edit I've done, sometimes I need to refresh the page before clicking a link to test my code. Other times, all the updates are on the controller and the template, so I don't need to refresh. In this case, I think that I do, because the link that I have here will not be carrying the ID of the listed item that I want to include the card in. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page. When in doubt, you can just go ahead and refresh. It's not bad. And I'll make one that's okay. Include card. Okay. So when I created that link, it by default initiates a full refresh. I didn't tell it that the link is actually a AJAX. So I'm going to go back to where I defined the link, include card. And I'm going to say remote is true. Okay. Let's look at my server to see what happened. Okay, undefined method merge for 89. Okay, so I got the API, I got the method signature a little bit wrong for this one here, line 4, hidden field. With this API, you don't just put the ID in there, you label it as the value. Okay, let's try again. Okay, so here's the form. Fairgrounds Warden. Click include, and that, let's see what happened here. Okay. The action create could not be found for card inclusions controller. So this button was initiating a full refresh. You can see here in the log. Well, I guess you can't quite see. The form should be labeled as remote in the same way that the link should, because I do not want this link to initiate a full refresh. The reason why the error screen was not shown to me was, I think, because of the way TurboLinks handles this response type. Anyway, it's going to show you that error, but now I get to teach you two things. So I'm going to go back to my controller and def create card inclusion equals card inclusion dot create card inclusion params. Okay, def card inclusion params dot require card inclusion dot permit card ID, or no, okay, yeah, we would permit that. Card name, we are permitting that. piece ID and piece type. Okay. Normally I omit parentheses wherever they're not needed. In Ruby, if they're implied, then they're not required. So I'll just leave it at that for now. Card.create, and then what are we going to, okay, so what the matter of what we're going to render after words is kind of separate. So for now, I'm just going to leave this as is and see if we can get our system to the point where it's actually saving the data. Now I'm also going to take a peek. Okay, so this errored out before it even showed me whether any params were being submitted. So let's just try submitting this again. If I hover over this thing, I can see my little tool set. Click. Might want to make that a little bit more opaque now that I have an actual interface there. And no template was found. Looking at the parameters that were submitted, we got a card name, a piece ID, and a piece type. Okay. So the database part of this log is telling me that rollback, it was not saved. Rollback means like the save was undone. And the reason for that is because we didn't say the card ID, we just said the card name. So let's start by saying card equals card.where. Actually, I think find by is slightly better. Card inclusion params card name. The difference is that if I said where, it would give me a collection. So even though the collection only had one element, I would have to call another method to get that element out of the collection. I would say, normally what I would do is I would say card where this, and then I would say first. But this is a new experiment that I'm trying. I think this API is a little better for me because I don't have to call first. And that means I don't have to use parentheses. Okay, so the question is, how do I get this card's ID into this body of data? And what we're broaching here is a often inevitable breakage of create gets broken into new and then save. And what happens in between is we use our program's logic to fill in the blanks. So let's try this again. And I'm using my intuition to determine that we can just submit the same thing again. It's not always the case, remember. Sometimes it's a good practice to just refresh the page in between tests so that you know you're not forgetting some subtle thing. But in this case it worked, and we can now go to our console, reload it so that it gets all the new code we wrote, and card inclusion.count. We have one, we saved one. Card inclusion.first. I'll use C equals underscore to grab the last item that I just returned. And then I'll see C.card, it's Fairgrounds Warden, C.listed item, C.piece, it's listed item, and C.piece.list, creatures dropped with Champion of Ronus. So we've successfully associated this data with that listed item. So before we generate like an Ajaxy update for that process, what I'm going to do is, I guess what I'm saying is before I create the interface that makes it nice and funky for the content creator, I'm going to make the interface that makes it visible to the visitor. So basically when I refresh this page, I should now see that card without having to hover. So going into, I guess I'll just trace the whole little path for you guys. When I show a list, I have the name, the description, links to edit and sort the list, and then for each item in the list, I display it using this helper method. This helper method is written in this helper. Listed item display is here. Display, if it's an ordered list, then you put the number first for like top 10 and stuff, top 5, top 20, whatever you want to top, however many things you want to put on your list. They can be numbered if you create a numbered list. Then there's the description, then there's the expression, and then if there's a list in that item, if it's a nested list as part of that item, then that's there. So I'm going to put the cards after the expression, or in the expression. Let's think. Yeah. We're going to put them on the right side in the expression. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is do plus, and then I'm going to say listed item dot cards dot each do card. Okay, so this is how, these are some of the syntactical ways that writing a helper differs from writing in a template. First of all, if I want to do plus, I have to put parentheses around everything that I'm plussing, appending, concatenating, whatever it is. And then secondly, if I want to do looping, I can't just expect the code in the loop to become part of the output. I have to replace each with map, and then I have to join together all the things that get generated by that map. And frequently when I join things, I also end up having to HTML save them. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that preemptively, even though I'm not 100% sure if it's necessary. But okay, so the card at this point, I probably want to wrap it in a div to make sure that I have good options for styling. I'm going to do that. Yeah, I think that basically what I'm going to do is image tag for the card dot image URL. I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it in a div. So div for card do and just nice and simple for now. And I can use CSS based on the fact that I have this nested structure to make it styled the way that I need. So I'm not using parentheses here because I'm not actually plussing this against anything. I am plussing this, but I think the syntax is right. All right, let's see what happens. Yep, there it is. You're coming with me. By the way, can you tell the reason I think this is a good creature to drop with Champion of Ronas? Because this would take effect during the declare attackers phase. So you can clean up their board such that they're less likely to kill your champion. Okay. So now that this works, obviously it's not done, but now that it works, sometimes I like to go ahead and consolidate my progress. So I'm going to GitHub and look at all the files we've edited so far. So we created the controller, we edited the helper, we wrote this model. Give you a moment to read that. We added some associations to card. We added some associations to listed item. And you can see how those are kind of a mirror image of each other. They reach through the join table. We created the template that allows people to type in the card name, passes the card, it passes the listed item ID through. And there's a good alternative to this, this type of architecture. Rather than using this link to pass the listed item ID to the server, which then passes back a form that includes the listed ID, which then submits to the server with the listed ID, the alternative would be to display the form and then have a JavaScript in our manifest that tells the form to gather the listed item ID from this HTML element while it's being submitted. So that's a good alternative, and I think that over time I will quite possibly migrate the system to take advantage of something like that. I think I consider this approach simpler. I think using Ruby instead of JavaScript is usually the right choice. I know it's a very controversial stance, but throughout my career that has always made sense to me, and I look forward to going into more depth with you guys on that in the future. One thing that would persuade me to jump over the fence and start doing that scripted implicit structure is when when I start using this interface for multiple different things besides just listed items. That alternative approach will probably give me code that I can drop in and reuse without editing it. So that is, it's pretty compelling. So I do like to implement things in kind of a very basic way first and then update them later. I am kind of getting to the point where I might start to not do that, but I might start to just kind of swing for the fences on my first try and make like a totally Ajax-y pretty style, well, not style, but an Ajax-y interface on the first try. But you know, with autocompletes and stuff like that. You could even have image previews for along with the autocomplete, so that you know the card. We could even do text search through the card text, so you can just type what it does and it will. Anyway, I'll just quickly mention the rest of the files that we're committing. So the roots file, that is the one that created it allowed me to create those links that are leading to the correct place. This is the migration that outline the structure, the changes to the structure of the database. This is the database file that is tracking all the structures that we have. This is a fabricator that is a file which in the future will allow us to generate sample data or theoretical data. And this is a spec, which is a file that will allow us to test our code. So I'm going to say cards can be included in listed items. Just kind of a functional discussion of what is possible rather than what we did. And then, so the first thing that's obvious we should do is use CSS to change the size of this image. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into my list CSS file. And try 120, see how that looks. So you can see how I'll make it closer to that size so you can see how much sharper these new images are. So I think it's pretty obvious now why I decided to switch to the new data. And I am planning for this to go to the right side. Okay. So the reason this appeared here is because the editing tools are already floating to the right. And the reason this is falling out of the list item is because there's no clear div on the... Maybe floating is not what I want here. Maybe I should say position relative. Okay, this is actually not correct either. For one thing, relative positioning only works within absolutely positioned elements. Or I'm oversimplifying, but this is, I think, more of an old... Okay, I guess we're going to be learning this together. So what I want is for this card to basically go all the way to the right. So these editing tools So I've floated them to the right, which actually means that I could push them up above the designation. So now they go up to the top. Oh, but they pushed it down. That's not appropriate. Okay, I think I'm going to pursue a bit of an awkward compromise here because I don't want to go really into the weeds just now. What I'm going to do is actually display none these and display block only when they're being hovered over, because I want this spacing to be correct for the view, yeah. It takes away my nice little hover thing. That's not a terrible interface. Okay. Does take away my nice little opacity shift that I was so proud of, but going to revisit the possibility of floating this right. And I'm going to change its width back to 1. I'll make it 150. Okay. So it is still going below. Oh, right, because I didn't put it in the designation, I put it in the expression. A lot of listed items are just going to have a designation and no expression, so this is a issue that I may face going forward, but for now what I'm going to do is after all the cards are actually, no matter what's in the expression, nothing should be falling out the bottom. So I'm just going to add a clear both here. And I don't know if I have yet defined clear both in this project. I use clear both in every project, but I haven't defined it yet. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to my application helper. Actually, don't know if I want to show you guys that. I think it's safe, but for now I'll just define clear both in this helper. And tag.div class clear both. And then I'll go to my CSS and I'll say scaffolds. Clear both is clear both. And clear both is just a technique that you use when you're floating divs around. So now it will make sure that this this div extends to the bottom of where that clear both is. All right, so now let's try this again. Oh. So that's actually a good point, is what happens when I misspell the card. How do I tell the user that an error has occurred? How do I tell them that an error has not occurred? How do I tell them that their thing was successful? So some of you might be wondering why I'm allowing this to remain here now that I have it here. And the answer is because with this new system in place, people will not need to use these tags. So I'll just assume that they'll use that tag when they want to use that hover style, and they'll use this thing when they want to use this style. So they're both available now. All right, thank you so much for joining me. I have some more interface updates to do, but right now I have to take a break. Remember to join me at Ways We Mage. Anyone who purchases the book can make these lists. They're very simple to make. They have a very expressive range. There's a lot of different things you can do with the lists, but the basic things you can do are extremely simple. And this is the video that tells you some of the techniques for how to make those edits. And so remember, the book is $2. There's a free chapter available every day. And when you buy it, you get to give it to 4 other people. So you're basically paying 40 cents per copy, and that gets you kind of a lifetime access to all the updates. So remember to buy that. Ask your friends to buy it for your cousins so that you'll have people to play against when you go on vacation. And I'll see you guys at HasCon. And I'll see you later tonight when I upload the next video.